anti-Semitism. One often hears, "What has the Pope said?" As if Catholics can check their powers of prudential reason at the door just because we have a Pope. I leave it to the theologians among us, of which I am not one, to explain the doctrine of infallibility, which is often wrongly invoked to cover anything a Pope says. But let us non-theologians stick with the non-theological facts. A long line of teaching instructs the laity that we have a unique role on earth and in salvation history. And if that teaching applies anywhere, it is here in the case of Catholics and the need to step up against anti-Semitism. We can't duck our responsibilities toward Jews or our other responsibilities. When you believe, as the Catechism and other Catholic texts teach, that you are made in the image of nothing less than God, when you believe, as some of the greatest Catholic teachers in history have taught across the centuries, that you have been gifted with faculties of reason that allow you to approach the truths of God, when you drink all that Catholic Kool-Aid, you are on the hook for figuring out what you can do to, quote, perfect the temporal order, as it says in the 1965 Decree on the Apostolate of the Laity, among other places, and that includes combating hatred and violence against Jews. Now, to the second question, how would you persuade Catholics who might initially dismiss these concerns about anti-Semitism to recognize the reality of the issue? This brings us to the second point I am here to share. Especially since October 7th, 2023, two malignant ideas have quietly, if unstably, hovered over the Western landscape. One is that the Jews somehow brought this post-October 7th infamy on themselves. This is classic blame the victim anti-Semitism. It is not true any more than it is true that the United States brought 9/11 on itself. But this smear continues to make the rounds in memes and elsewhere online and wherever stupid ideas are sold. The second pseudo-sophisticated and even more pernicious variation of this idea is that pox on all the houses moral equivalence. October 7th was a tragedy, but what Israel has done since then is worse, goes this line of excuse-making. Both these ideas are wrong and injurious, and they are also, to repeat, unworthy of people with working left and right hemispheres. This brings us to my second point. Catholics of all Christians are uniquely positioned to repel these malevolent interjections. Specifically, just war theory is a body of teaching stretching back well over 1,000 years and benefiting from some of the greatest minds in Catholic and indeed human history, including but not limited to St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and other headliners. Just war theory provides a moral template for understanding exactly what happened on October 7th, 2023 and beyond. Its applied principles demonstrate beyond a doubt who the aggressor was, who the innocent, who had the right of response and self-defense, etc. Just war theory smashes moral equivalence like an idol. To put it another way, our Protestant evangelical brothers and sisters have risen to the defense of the Jewish people with fighting spirit and in admirable numbers. This is in part for reasons of millenarian theology that Catholics do not share. But Catholics have a different reason for solidarity with people of the covenant. Not because we have theological or other expectations, but simply because it is the right thing to do intrinsically as Catholics. Third question, how do you respond to those who argue that accusations of anti-Semitism are being overused or exaggerated in today's discourse? Some will remember from Philosophy 101 the story of 18th century philosopher George Berkeley, who came up with the idea of immaterialism, the notion that the world is not real. And in response to that theory, the great wit Samuel Johnson is said to have kicked a rock, announcing, "I refute it thus." That is actually the best way to deep six the malignant suggestion that anti-Semitism is being hyped. Just refuse to play that game. Of course, one can also point to the empirical record. History abounds for millennia with examples of bloody enthusiasms aimed at wiping out the Jews, including the murders and kidnappings committed by Hamas on October 7th and beyond. Yet, as the horrors of the 20th century recede from living memory, and as social media takes the place for many of verifiable history, we cannot expect knowledge of the past alone to encourage Catholics to do the right thing. We need more. And this brings me to a third point that I hope will be taken to heart by fellow Catholics everywhere, most especially the young. In addition to just war theory, Catholics, and especially young Catholics, whatever the state of their religious practice, have a particular, unique vernacular for understanding anti-Semitism and the need to protect and defend those among us in need of aid. That is their dedication, which is most ardent among the young, to the cause of life. As I said at the conference at Franciscan, Hamas and other enemies of the Jewish people often say, scornfully, the Jews love life. So do we. To love life as Catholics is to love the Jews from whose roots we grew. Our young Catholics in America and elsewhere are empaths. All they need to know to rise to the occasion is that the refusal of the Jewish people to die has enraged their enemies throughout history. All they need to know is that the Jewish love of life, which is nothing less than a love of life enjoined by God Himself since the earliest appearances in Scripture, binds Jews and Christians together as no other force. This joint love of life, shared by Christians and Jews, is a slap in the face to our common enemies: desiccated anti-life secularism, bloodthirsty Islamicism, suicidal marriage and baby denialism. The same people and forces who hate the Jews hate the Christians too, including for our own love of life. Consider, since October 7th, anti-Semitic offenses have risen almost threefold in the United States. Since summer 2020, a record number of Catholic churches and other properties have been attacked and defaced across the country. And not only in the United States. As Robert Royal shows in his new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium, more Christians are in more danger of martyrdom today than at any other moment in history. As the months and years since October 7th have also shown, the desire to wipe Jews from creation has been invigorated anew by Hamas, by other terrorist groups, and by their cold-blooded cheerleaders in America and Europe, including on certain feral campuses. Today, the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism takes a new step, calling Catholics to a new abolitionism. The old abolitionism arose first in the 18th century, mainly in the salons of Enlightenment Europe. Left to the intellectuals, it would surely have died a slow death in drawing rooms. But instead, something else happened. The calloused hands of farmers and others far removed from salons, toiling the land in places like New England and upstate New York, took up their scripture and took the fact of slavery to heart. It was prayers and preachings in tiny Protestant churches by Quakers and Wesleyans and other anonymous souls that found doing the right thing by slaves inescapable. So let Catholics anew, beginning today, join hands in a new abolitionism, a summons to stepped-up solidarity with the Jewish people in a moment when the malignity aimed at them continues to reveal its serpentine face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Okay. Question 2 is for Jonathan. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, well, you know, since we met in Israel 2 years ago, Jonathan, I've very much deeply valued our friendship and our collaboration. I look forward to many more. I'm saying that in public, so we have to. And you know, recently I spoke with a priest about this issue, and his response was, you know, I understand the historical context, and that's important, but is this really a crisis in the church today? Most Catholics aren't anti-Semitic, and if anything, it's the opposite. For those whose daily lives don't bring them face to face with this issue, what's the larger picture? Why does this matter now? Not just as a question of history, but as something urgent for the church and for society today.
Okay. Small questions. First of all, I want to thank Father Charles for inviting us and for the honor of being able to address you. I want to thank you, Simone, for putting this conversation together. One of the most important conversations, I think, at this hour in our republic that we can have. I also want to begin by with a note of gratitude. Here in this room are 2 teachers of mine that have taught me to think morally in ways that I just can't, but I have to thank them. George Weigel is here, and over the years I've learned so much from George Weigel, as I have from, I'm so honored to be able to sit on the same panel as Mary Eberstadt. Their writing, their teaching, their example, I just want to publicly thank both of them. Let me make 5 quick points, and then I think it's probably more productive for us to spend some more time in conversation together. Anti-Semitism is what exactly? Anti-Semitism is a discrimination? Is it a racial hatred? Is anti-Semitism a spiritual disorder? Is it a social contagion? Is it an ideological predilection? Anti-Semitism, I think the first point to make about it is its mutability. In ages of our civilizational past, when religion and theology was the dominant heuristic and dominant civilizational authority, then anti-Semitism was advanced using theological arguments. In ages where natural science overcame religion and became the dominant authority of the culture, then anti-Semitism was advanced in pseudo-racialist science. Today, when human rights ideology tends to be the dominant moral and civic political authority of our time, anti-Semitism tends to be advanced in that kind of language as well. I think these are all partial ways to understand the phenomenon, but I would like to suggest, point number 2, that there is a more comprehensive, clearer, more precise way to diagnose what anti-Semitism is. By my lights, anti-Semitism is politics organized against the Jews. That's what it is. And that means that anti-Semitism, to embrace anti-Semitism, is to embrace a politics of blame. It is to embrace a politics of grievance. It is to reject a politics of accountability. It's to reject a politics of responsibility. Anti-Semitism in this respect is antithetical to the fundaments of Republican self-government. So I would say, to begin with, that it is a unique threat in democratic governments like the one that we have in America. Why the Jews, after all? I think there are historical and religious, philosophical reasons for that. After all, it is a theme diagnosed in even ancient authors, as well as modern medieval authors too. When ancient tribes conquered one another, they assimilated the pantheon of the conquered people. And when you were conquered, it showed that your God was also defeated. Your protector God was defeated. This is the way pagan societies works. And so you follow the determination of the might and you adopt their gods. The Jews did not do this. And from that time to this time, there is a religious inassimilability of the Jews that others them, to use that kind of word. But I actually think that, hearkening back to the political theme that I'm asking you to focus on, there's an even more practical political reason why the Jews are always such a convenient target. You see, up until the 18th century, the Jews had no rights in European history. Up until 1948, the Jews did not have their own arms and military. The Jews could never respond when attacked. Think of how convenient this is as a target. On the one hand, they were spread throughout virtually every society of Europe. By the way, also in the Arab Middle East. They were spread throughout all of these societies, often trying to figure out ways to accommodate themselves in societies without rights, and so made themselves to be of service, having all kinds of important jobs in those societies. Nevertheless, they were not organized in such a way that when attacked, they could extract a political cost. So they were a permanent minority spread throughout all of these different societies without the ability to extract political costs when attacked. That is the perfect target for those who wish to evade responsibility for their own problems. They can blame this other little group that everybody knows and has seen, and that if you do something horrible to them, they cannot respond to you. Point number 4, and I think this is implied in what I've said, but I want to just draw it closer to the surface. I have to say that my real concern, the real reason that I came to visit with you all today, is not for my own people. It's not for the Jewish people. And that is because I'm profoundly concerned anti-Semitism harms the anti-Semite more than it harms the target of anti-Semitism. A culture that embraces blame, this is an iron law of worldly politics, cannot but slouch into decline. There is something that happens in the soul of a polity and the soul of a person when they fail to take responsibility for themselves and when they are casting instead that responsibility to another group like that. I just think, Simone and I were talking about this the other day. There is this magnificent portrait that Frederick Douglass draws in one of his several autobiographies, in which he describes the effect of slave owning on the slave owner. I just want to read that to you for a moment, not because I'm drawing an illusion between these two phenomena, but because to me it creates a psychological portrait that I think reveals something about the same effects that happen in the soul of the anti-Semite. Frederick Douglass, the narrative, I'm reading now from the one of his biographies called The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass. It's published in 1854. And he is horribly sold to this woman in Baltimore named Sophia Old, the Old family, who had never owned slaves before. He doesn't really know how to deal with her because she's actually a kindly person. This is what he writes. She was by trade, this is what Frederick Douglass, writes. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been good in a degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. I want to propose that anti-Semitism has a similar kind of effect on the anti-Semite. And therefore, just to diagnose this phenomenon, it does not inhere in the Jews any more than a virus inheres on its target. Anti-Semitism is a problem that, as a society, we have to confront as Americans. Maybe as a church, I leave it to my dear Catholic friends to diagnose whether the extent to which it's really a problem there. But point number 5, because anti-Semitism reveals something about this political psychology of a regime, maybe of a person, it illuminates our capacity for self-government. I want to propose, just leave you with this, that anti-Semitism should be understood as a barometer of civic health. As an American, I believe that the rejection of the politics of grievance is the fight for the soul of America in the West. It's a fight that is up to us, Jews and Christians, to stand shoulder to shoulder and fight for this civilization which our ancestors labored for so many generations to bequeath to us, and which now it is our responsibility to hand over to our posterity. Thank you.
Trent, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you for coming to join us in person, all the way from Texas. I first met you when I started working at Catholic Answers as an affiliate apologist in 2022, but I feel like I really came to really, really love you when you had me on your show to talk about what was happening to the Armenians in 2023. Rough year, 2023. Jewish college students, particularly at Ivy League institutions, have faced significant challenges over the past year coming from the left. This past January, I spoke with a Jewish student from an Ivy League school who asked me, is what I'm seeing on social media, is it real? From the extreme right, is it real? Regrettably, I had to answer, it is real, I'm sorry. And part of my job is to help keep it on the fringe and prevent it from becoming mainstream. And he responded, but didn't the Council of Trent already settle this? Anti-Semitism today appears to be growing more sophisticated and harder to dismiss as merely an internet phenomenon. While it might be tempting to write it off as the rantings of a fringe group of extreme right anti-Semitists or extreme left, I've had to explain that it is more complex. What should Catholics know about this resurgence? And how should they understand what's happening and why it's occurring?
Thank you, Simone, and thank you so much for inviting me here today to address you. On April 27th, 2019, 19-year-old John Ernest walked into a synagogue in Poway, California with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and opened fire. He injured 3 people, including the synagogue's rabbi, and fatally wounded a woman named Lori Gilbert Kay. Ernest fled the scene and was later apprehended and then convicted of his crimes. He received a sentence of life in prison plus 30 years. What struck me most about Ernest's case was the content of the manifesto he published before his crime. It was teeming with anti-Semitic claims and arguments I have seen all over the internet, even among self-professed Christians. In fact, Ernest called himself a Christian in his manifesto. He belonged to a traditionally Orthodox Presbyterian church and had no previous criminal record before his crime. He poignantly writes in the manifesto, "To my family and friends, I can already hear your voices. How could you throw your life away? You had everything." Ernest's answer, "I will not sell my soul by sitting idly by as evil grows. I'd rather die in glory or spend the rest of my life in prison than waste away knowing that I did nothing to stop this evil." That evil, he said, were the Jews. He writes, "Every Jew is responsible for the meticulously planned genocide of the European race. They act as a unit, and every Jew plays his part to enslave the other races around him, whether consciously or subconsciously. Their crimes are endless." His manifesto then lays a laundry list of crimes at the feet of the Jews: controlling the media, usury, Marxism, communism, sexual degeneracy, feminism, pornography, the slave trade, genocide, especially white genocide, killing children, and of course, killing Jesus. He says, "For these crimes, they deserve nothing but hell. I will send them there." He continues, "I did not choose to be a Christian. The Father chose me." When it comes to the objection that he should, as a Christian, love his enemies, Ernest says one would not love a thief robbing a friend by doing nothing to help the friend. One can kill in self-defense. And he claims, "I did not want to have to kill Jews, but they have given us no other option. I'm just a normal dude who wanted to have a family, help and heal people, and play piano. But the Jew, with his genocidal instincts, is insistent on poking the bear until it tears his head off." Now, some people may say that Ernest was just one violent fanatic and anti-Semitism isn't a big problem. But Ernest's rhetoric is neither novel nor uncommon. Adolf Hitler's book Mein Kampf and addresses like his 1920 speech, Why We Must Be Anti-Semites, are filled with this same kind of rhetoric. The Jews are a dangerous threat to society, and they must be contained by any means necessary. And Hitler's ideology is spreading. In 2024, the New York Post reported on how AI translations of Hitler's speeches into English have garnered millions of views on social media and millions of positive reactions. Prominent social media accounts deny Hitler was involved in genocide and portray him as a misunderstood leader in a war where there were no good guys because, according to them, each side of the war killed civilians in comparable fashion. When placed in a sympathetic lens, young people are more apt to be seduced by anti-Semitic rhetoric that mirrors the same arguments Ernest made in his manifesto. In the past few years, I have noticed an explosive growth in anti-Semitic content online, including among self-proclaimed Christians. They claim they don't hate Jewish people, and so they are not anti-Semitic in the classic sense of that word. Their belief system is also immune to the common reply that a Christian cannot be anti-Semitic because Jesus, Mary, and the apostles were Jews. These Christian anti-Semites say they do not hate anyone. They say they do not hate anyone because of their ethnicity. Instead, they claim to simply adhere to the Bible's teaching that the Jews killed Jesus and that the Jews are an enemy of mankind. The only thing they hate, they claim, is the false religion of the Jews. But these anti-Semites routinely pull a bait and switch. When they are pressed, they say they only oppose the false religion of Judaism. However, when they see a Jew guilty of immorality, they publicly share this with the assumption that this incident proves ethnic Jews, even those who are not religious, are morally inferior to non-Jews. I remember seeing one anonymous account, a Catholic account, blame the actor Bryan Cranston's support for legal abortion not on his liberal Hollywood environment, but on the fact that he's 1/8 Jewish. They also say they're just being faithful to church teaching that paints the Jews as untrustworthy, subversive dangers to Christian society that must be segregated and contained. Anti-Semitism doesn't entice people by presenting itself as a wild-eyed, frothing at the mouth call to exterminate the Jews. Instead, it presents itself as a simple noticer of individual Jews engaged in immoral behavior, or Jews being overrepresented in certain fields. It then, through a combination of fallacies like confirmation bias and hasty generalization, claims that Jews are behind many or all the evils in the world. Like many conspiracy theories, these claims are warmly received by people who want a simple explanation for the problems in the world instead of the complex reality of how sin manifests itself in all races, creeds, and cultures. However, it doesn't take much to transform this rhetoric from simple noticing and jokes about Jews into warnings about dangerous Jewish supremacy, and finally into concrete actions to oppose what they call dangerous Jewish power, including violent actions like those of John Earnest and many others who have committed acts of violence against Jewish people. But anti-Semitism is wrong even if it does not result in violence. The Ku Klux Klan once violently persecuted Catholics in the United States in the early 20th century. But that doesn't mean it's okay to commit non-violent acts of anti-Catholicism today. It is still wrong for bigots to slander Catholics and harm them through lies about what Catholics do, just as it's wrong for anti-Semites to slander Jews from their keyboards, even if they never encounter a Jew in their daily lives. The problem also has a distinctly Christian element, as can be seen in Earnest's case. Anonymous social media accounts who have an abundance of free time and an abundance of Jew obsession mine the church fathers, ecumenical councils, papal documents, and 19th and 20th century Catholic authors for quotes that they claim give their Jew hatred a traditional and Orthodox pedigree. One of these accounts is even called for a final solution to the Jewish problem that claims Catholic teaching requires Jews to be deported to Israel so that Christians do not have to live with them. And their arguments seem impressive to Catholics who want to be faithful to traditional church teaching, but mistakenly think everything in previous magisterial documents belongs to the unchanging deposit of faith. This inability to understand the different levels of authority in church documents and how doctrine develops over time leads them to believing Catholics must endorse errors like geocentrism or anti-Semitism. In closing, we ignore this growing online problem, especially among Catholics, at our and others' peril. Posts defending Jew hatred, Holocaust denial, and worst of all, Holocaust cheerleading that openly calls for the death of Jews receive tens of thousands of likes on social media. And the problem will only get worse if we, out of ignorance, hubris, or cowardice, refuse to face it head on. But instead we must face it with hearts filled not with malice, but with the love of Christ that seeks to rescue people who have been ensnared by the father of lies. Thank you.
So now we'll take questions from all of you if you have scanned it. And I'll be checking my phone because it will get text message to me. No. Maybe your neighbor could help you with that. We will not take questions from the floor. You have to submit them through the Google form. Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists. I had a lot of self-restraint, not going, wow, after all of your presentations, but wow. First question, what aspects, and thank you to Susanna, who's filtering this from the Google form, what aspects of John Paul II's approach to interfaith dialogue can be applied today to strengthen bonds between Catholics and Jews? Should be another microphone there too.
I'm going to punt because if you stick around, George Weigel will be speaking later today, and I'm sure he will give the best earthly treatment possible of that question.
Yeah, I would just say, just going through the spirit of dialogue that we've seen from Pope St. John Paul II and also from Pope Benedict XVI, that the goal of dialogue is to lead both parties closer to the truth. And so there are two errors when it comes to dialogue. One is to see dialogue itself as an end instead of a means. So always just talking about agreements, but never the differences. And then the other extreme is to treat dialogue as more of a facade to engage in harsh polemics. I think what Pope St. John Paul II modeled well in his relations with Israel, with Jewish communities, is to find genuine common ground between our faiths. I think one of the great things about being Catholic is being able to share with Jewish people the Jewish roots of our faith. The Catholic author Brant Petrie has done an excellent work on that with his books like the Jewish roots of the Eucharist, the Jewish roots of Mary, being able to show that, and many other authors. Roy Schumann's book, Salvation is from the Jews, is another good work on that. Being able to show this common ground, and then Pope St. John Paul II, who had the humility to offer apologies for when the church has victimized those in the past, not just Jews, but other groups as well. So to be able to move forward in dialogue humbly, to find common ground, to lift away emotional and historical barriers, but then also to present the beauties of the faith for Jewish people to consider that are very unique to the Catholic faith.
Somebody have the second microphone.
Is this it?
No. Maybe we'll find it. Okay, second question. How have theological concepts like supersessionism and replacement theology historically contributed to anti-Semitic attitudes among Catholics? Until we find the second mic, I'll just keep passing this one. If anybody wants to take that.
I get to punt again because I'm not a theologian. I think that's a question for theologians.
I'm not technically a theologian either because I don't have a doctorate in theology, but theology is the mainstay for me. So supersessionism is the idea of trying to understand what is the relationship between the idea of the Jewish people and those who are called the people of God. You know, how is God's relationship to Jewish people after the revelation of Christ given to Christ and the apostles? And there have been strains in Catholic history among some of the fathers speaking about things like how the church fully replaces the Jewish people, or that the Jewish people, that God has formally rejected them, or that they have been cut off because of their rejection of Christianity, of Jesus as the Messiah. But while some of these sentiments can be found among church fathers and some theological writings, as Pope Benedict XVI noted, this is something that's very difficult to locate within the church's magisterial texts. And so more recently, we have seen an understanding and also a retrieval of ancient sources, seeing that while modern Judaism is, of course, incomplete because it rejects that Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as we've noted earlier, what previous popes have said, Judaism is distinct from every other non-Christian religion because of its foundation in Christianity, and also because of what the New Testament itself promises. The New Testament, that Paul, when he was engaging his Jewish interlocutors, he did not consider them others who were completely cut off from God. That's quite the opposite of what he says in Romans chapter 11, where he says that the gifts and calling of God, he said that the Jews of his time were blessed, would still be blessed because of their forefathers, and that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. So Catholic theology still seeks to find the middle ground of understanding because, once again, I think what we're always trying to do here is avoid extremes. So the one extreme is to say that the Jews are accursed by God, they are cut off, they are even worse off than other non-Christian religions. But then the other extreme would be to embrace a kind of dual covenant theology, which says that Jews are saved because of their faithfulness to the old covenant and that they have no need for salvation in Christ. That also is not true because Acts 4:12 very clearly says there is no other name by which we are saved except for Jesus Christ. But even by that truth, that did not prevent St. Paul from saying at the end of his letter to the Romans that he had hope that all Israel would be saved. So I think that in understanding this, there's still theological nuances to parse out. We just have to be careful to avoid the simplistic extreme ends of the spectrum on that question.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Trent. See? Wow. Okay, here's another question. Father Dave Pavanka was accused of virtue signaling when he opened up Franciscan University to Jewish transfer students who were feeling unsafe on their college campuses. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, it's calumny. Second, would that every Catholic college in the United States had done the same?
Yeah, I find that there are certain accusations I'm not really fazed by anymore because I don't understand the nature of the accusation. Like when people will call me, even today, and speaking at this event, I'm sure to be labeled online a modernist, liberal, and the fact that I've mentioned in other contexts, but not when I speak on this subject, that half my family is Jewish, I will certainly be labeled a converso, a Jew who is who's secretly trying to destroy the Catholic faith, but did so by writing a book called Why We're Catholic that sold 800,000 copies and has led to countless. Yes. So the goal is to be really like secretly trying to undermine the faith, be very outspoken and helping people become Catholic. I don't know. That's the illogic of anti-Semitism. That can see malice of Jews anywhere and in anything. I find the accusations you're virtue signaling. I would say, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? Usually, virtue signaling refers to engaging in an act that doesn't do any concrete good, but is only meant to assuage the conscience or to impress other similarly minded people. So that's the only way we think of virtue signaling. So we think of a celebrity who is going to act against climate change by going on a world tour to talk about it, when that doesn't do anything to address the problem, and the emissions from their private jet makes it worse. So that would be a classic example of virtue signaling. But if you notice there is a problem and you are able to offer a concrete solution, like Jewish students who are not permitted, who are prevented from accessing classes on campus by anti-Semitic mobs that the college authorities will not disperse or use the police power to disperse, when if the situation were reversed, when if it were Jews and Christians preventing Muslims from going to class, the FBI would be in there with assault weapons ready to arrest everyone and throw them in jail for decades. When there's a concrete problem and you offer an appropriate solution, I think the accusation of virtue signaling is rather just sour grapes from people that don't think it's a problem or are cheering on the problem itself.
We can agree that criticism of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic. But where is the line? When does it cross over into something anti-Jewish?
Yeah, I think that for people who have serious criticisms of Israel, welcome to the lunch table of every Israeli family. Every Israeli family, every Jewish American family has got their own criticisms, plenty of them. I don't know if there's a precise line that I can draw. I think there's some things that one can notice about the horrible atrocities that take place in various countries across the world, including some that have taken many hundreds of Muslims who've been persecuted and killed in just the last hours. And the outcry that is raised against those places is faint and non-existent. And when the Jewish state rises to heroically defend its own civilians, the outcry is loud and very different, and one can take notice of that. But I think any particular criticism that a critic might have of a tactic in war or policy of the Israeli government, I think one has got to take into account the spirit in which it's offered, and I promise that the most vociferous critic of Israel will not match the internal criticism that Israelis themselves mount on a daily, weekly, minute-by-minute basis of their own government.
Yeah, I would say a simple rule of thumb is criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic if the criticism would not be leveled against a non-Jewish state. So in discrimination law, for example, I forget the exact, the wording would be the but if rule. So when does discrimination become wrong? You say, well, we would treat you a certain way, but if you were white, we would treat you a different way. And so if Israel's action would not arouse outcry or condemnation if any other nation did it, then that begs the question, why is it a rising outcry in this situation? And it's because anti-Semites conflate Israel, the nation of Israel, with Jews as if they're synonymous, which, as my panel guest here noted, they're not. There's a wide variety of Jewish views. There are some Jews who are Zionists. There are Jews who are anti-Zionist. There are Jews across the political spectrum. Even within Judaism, you have the conservative and the liberal parties who differ on important issues. So I think just to ask yourself, well, if another country did this, or to find examples of other countries engaging in this kind of behavior in war, I think is helpful. I think also when people rush to make the claim of genocide, because they want to pin the worst crime possible on Jews, when you are critiquing a country in warfare, there's a big gap between acceptable use of force and genocide. There's negligence, there's willful negligence, there are war crimes, but genocide is a very specific term, and if it is misused, it just makes the term lose its effectiveness.
Okay, this question, I think you just answered it. All right. This is a little dangerous. I'm going to read it without reading it ahead of time. If one of my traditional Catholic friends brings up an old quote, for example, from St. Pius X, what should I say? She shared with me this: we cannot give approval to the Zionist movement. We cannot prevent the Jews from going to Jerusalem, but we could never sanction it. The soil of Jerusalem, if it was not always sacred, has been sanctified by the life of Jesus Christ. As the head of the church, I cannot tell you anything different. The Jews have not recognized our Lord. Therefore, we cannot recognize the Jewish people. This is an answer given to Theodore Herzl in a private letter.
Yes. So I would say if someone comes across a quote from a previous pope or a previous bishop or even a previous ecumenical council, they have to remember that as Catholics, Christ gave us a living magisterium. So the church's authority comes from three elements: sacred scripture, so the Word of God given to us in written form, which is sacred scripture; the Word of God given to us in an unwritten form, which is the tradition lived out in the church; and the teaching of the magisterium. And as the Second Vatican Council Dei Verbum document on divine revelation, Constitution on divine revelation, Dei Verbum says, the magisterium is not above scripture and tradition, but it humbly serves them. So it passes on the deposit of faith through its teaching office. I would also tell this person that many people, I'm going to be beating a dead horse here, but that's okay. I gotta love Aristotle, the golden mean, the middle ground. When it comes to interpreting past church documents, once again, there are two extremes. One extreme would be the liberal, truly modernist view, which says that previous magisterial teaching is not binding in any case. And the bishops today could reverse anything that's been taught in the past on any subject. Which is a kind of theological positivism that would destroy any notion of a deposit of faith if the bishops could because they could just make up anything they wanted to. The other extreme, though, is what I call Catholic fundamentalism. And this is a term that I prefer to. Some people have identified anti-Semitism with traditionalism, or they might call it radical traditionalism. I don't like those terms because there's nothing wrong with being traditional. And there's nothing wrong necessarily being radical or extreme. Martin Luther King Jr. said, people asked him, are you an extremist? He said, well, yeah, but you could be an extremist for love and an extremist for justice. Nothing wrong with that. So nothing being radically in favor of the church's wonderful tradition. Fundamentalism, however, seeks to look at the past teachings and make them binding today when they are no longer binding. To read things in previous documents and not understand, I would tell them if they read something in the past to know, where does the source of teaching, how do we understand as Catholics? It's very easy as Catholics for us to say, oh, well, we're not sola scriptura. We don't just all read the Bible for ourselves and say, this is what it means. We listen to the teaching office of the church. But fundamentalists will do that with church history. Instead of listening to the living magisterium that exists today, they will say, I've read through all the church's teaching in the past, and this is what it means. But when Catholic fundamentalists do that with previous church teaching, they're no different than the Protestant reformers who did the same thing with scripture and the church fathers and the medieval writers. They also claimed history for themselves. So I would tell your friend, if they read something in one of these documents, one, compare it to what the living magisterium teaches today, and let that guide you, because that is what Christ gave us to guide us in the faith, the apostles and their successors. Number two, I would encourage them to know that Catholic teaching has different levels of authority. So not everything that is found in magisterial documents is infallible. So there's two extremes. None of it's infallible and all of it's infallible. Rather, a very small minority of it is infallible. So Catholic teaching can change in its level of authority. So for example, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Among the early church fathers, there was theological debate about Mary. They knew she was radically holy. She was called, the unstained ark. But then this had to be reconciled with the universal truth about original sin. So Mary's Immaculate Conception was something that was found in the early church, then later became a common teaching. So it rises in its levels of the authority the church teaches until finally in the 19th century, it was infallibly taught through a papal ex cathedra statement. But other teachings can lose some of their authority. They can be taught or they could be widely believed, but the magisterium comes to see, oh, this is not an essential part of the depositive faith. That's what's happened with the doctrine of limbo. Once again, theologians trying to remedy what happens to unbaptized children who have committed no sins. And many of them held to a view that these children went to limbo, which is the outer edge of hell, but it's a place of perfect natural happiness. They don't receive the beatific vision, but they don't suffer either. They have perfect natural happiness. That's still a permitted view. It has not been condemned. But as the International Theological Commission noted since 2007, the magisterium is moving more towards a view that we can have a hopeful confidence, but not a 100% assurance that children who die without baptism can receive the beatific vision. Hopeful confidence, not 100% assurance. So when it comes to statements regarding the Jews, for example, and that, as I noted in my answer, Catholic anti-Semites will and we'll discuss this later in other panels about how the church is related to Jews and spoken about it in magisterial texts, that these things may represent prudential judgments. Sometimes they're prudential judgments, interventions in the prudential order. Donum Veritatis, instruction on the vocation of the theologian, that came out a few years ago. That said, in section 24, in magisterial documents, not every prudential judgment is free from error. Bishops and their advisors may not have taken all elements into consideration. So papal documents, magisterial documents that spoke about the necessity of putting Jews in ghettos or deporting them, many times costing people their lives in the process. We could say, well, that prudential judgment was an error. It overestimated the risk these people pose and underestimated the harms imposed on them in trying to deal with a worldly problem at the time. Similar with other elements where doctrine may be proposed, but it's not defined, and then it's understood that that's not an essential element of the doctrine of faith. So like the example you gave about Pope St. Pius X, by the way, notice where it comes from. So that quote, actually, that is not even in a magisterial text. So you could find something to say, is it magisterial? Magisterial means it comes from the bishops, or it comes from the Pope. So if it's just a church father saying something, it's not necessarily going to be magisterial. If it's a Catholic theologian, and there are theologians that have put forward anti-Semitic views, that's not magisterial. Or if it's a pope in a private matter, or in the case of Herzl was one of the founders of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, was involved in that, and he goes to Pope St. Pius X. That quote is not found in a document in the Vatican or from the writings of Pope St. Pius X. It's a reflection in Herzl's diary about the interaction. Pope St. Pius may have said that. He may have said that, but guess what? It's not written down in anything magisterial, so it doesn't have any binding weight on Catholics whatsoever. I would recommend to your the friend in that question, if they want to learn more about how to read previous documents, my friend and colleague Jimmy Aiken has written a wonderful book called Teaching with Authority, and it's a comprehensive book that deals with how to understand the weight, the authority behind Catholic teaching in documents.
Thank you, Trent. I'm so glad that you mentioned the fact that that was in the diary and not in a magisterial document. I might also add, I'm not an official panelist here, but Pope Benedict XVI has a great document on the Jews that is a defense of, you could say, Catholic Zionism, where, as Mary mentioned, we don't have the same Protestant evangelical theologies, but we do have, if you wanted to have a theological support for Catholic Zionism, it would simply be that the Jews, like any other natural people, have a right to safety and protection in their country that already exists. So
I'd also add, when fundamentalists go down this road, I've heard it said from another author who is doing a playful twist on Cardinal Henry Newman's quote, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." His twist on that is, to be deep in history is to cease to be a fundamentalist, because it is impossible to live in accord with strict fundamentalism that says, I'm a traditional Catholic, I'm going to do everything I find in the tradition, when there are things in the tradition that are just not livable or people don't adhere to anymore. I think it was the Lateran Ecumenical Council had a binding statement that you could only use crossbows against Muslims, not Christians. But that's something that's a disciplinary matter. I'm sure, if a Christian was breaking into your home and going to kill your family and all you have is your dad's old crossbow next to you, it could happen to someone, I'm sure. And of course, a fortiori, if you can't use a crossbow against a Christian, you couldn't use a deadlier weapon like a firearm. But fundamentalists still hold to that today. Or there was, I think it was the Council of Trullo, perhaps, and this would be in the early Middle Ages, which is one of the disciplinary canons, said that Christians were prohibited from seeing Jewish physicians. So you'll have fundamentalists who will rail about Jews when all of a sudden, if they need, surprise, surprise, someone who's overrepresented in the medical field but doesn't get credit. If a Jew is overrepresented in a bad thing, they cause the bad thing. But if they're overrepresented in a good thing, like inventions or medicine, they don't get credit, or they're overrepresented there in order to exploit people there or something. You can't win. Once again, the ill logic of anti-Semitism. So if they need a Jewish doctor to save them and their children, well, they're not going to complain about that, or they're not even going to bother to check. So to be deep in history is to cease to be fundamentalist.
I love that. I had a priest friend who said recently, the church is never wrong, but we're wrong about what the church has never been wrong about. All right, next question. Can you elaborate on the statement that anti-Semitism is a barometer of civic health, specifically as it relates to the state of the Catholic Church today? Is the appearance of an uptick in anti-Semitism among Catholics a phenomenon of the internet? If not, if it's more, what does that say about where the church is today? I'm happy for this question because, Jonathan, you and I talk a lot about how we want to kind of get past the anti-Semitism, the Christian anti-Semitism, the Catholic anti-Semitism, so we can have the more interesting conversation about, rebuilding Western civilization. Before you answer, Jonathan, if I can put you on the spot there, I'm going to read this quotation by Father Edward Flannery from a book he wrote, The Anguish of the Jews, 23 Centuries of Anti-Semitism. If you've never read it, I highly recommend. He says, the blueprint for the extinction of Christian anti-Semitism is ostensibly already on paper. It is to be found in the statements and guidelines of the churches and in the work of the revisionist theologians. Regrettably, the present pace of its dissemination and its implementation is slow. Most of the Christian populace has not been reached.
Okay, I think I can explain what I mean by anti-Semitism as a barometer of civic health. I'm not sure I can do as good a job as my colleagues can to diagnose its presence within the church and in the online communities that the church is responsible for uplifting. But I can observe that societies that have organized themselves around blaming some other group do not constructively solve their own problems. And that is true in the Middle East, and it is true in sub-communities that are full of especially young women and men who are economically disadvantaged and suffering. And it is easier as a kind of, it is easier way to alleviate their suffering to blame someone else as a kind of scapegoat than it is to constructively solve their problems. And so I do see that the presence of anti-Semitism in a culture tells you something about its viability. And where anti-Semitism has gained purchase, that culture is going to decline. I just don't think that there are any examples that history furnishes against that.
I'd like to say just a few words about another source of what may be rising anti-Semitism. And this is not one I've seen discussed, but it's palpable. And I want to put a Catholic lens on it and to mention the 7 deadly sins that we don't like to talk about, even during Lent, because it's like hard to think of how we fall short in all these areas. But one of them is envy. And I think envy applies here on 2 levels. The first is obvious. The first, as Trent mentioned, the overrepresentation of Jews in fields of success, fields like medicine and music and scholarship and other elite and remarkable areas. And so there is, I think, a kind of envy on the part of those who see this and do not have the habits of study, the long familial traditions, the long biblical traditions that are part of what goes into that kind of worldly success, as does having been shut out of other ways of making a living. So that's on the surface, but I think underneath it and more interesting, if you open the aperture here and you look at the modern West, you see societies in demographic and spiritual freefall. And obviously there are exceptions. There are vibrant exceptions to this. We're at the CIC after all. And we could all name scores of other exceptions. But the biggest exception here is Israel. The biggest exception is Jews in Israel, seculars included, saying yes to life in a way that the societies of Europe and much of the Anglosphere seems to have forgotten how to do. So if you're in Israel on the Sabbath, you will see families in the streets. You will see strollers everywhere. You will see babies in restaurants, no matter whether it's Sabbath or not. You'll see people out and about with their families because the birth rate in Israel is higher than it is in any other Western country. These are people who refuse to lay down and die and continue to say yes to life. How could the sometimes desiccated people of the West who seem to have lost their own morale not look upon that with a sense of envy, or at least a pang? Why can't we be more like that? And I really believe that at some seismic level, these are the rocks that are shifting that give rise on the surface to what we're calling anti-Semitism.
Oh, Dad. I think something else that we need to consider would be that anti-Semitism is often related to politics of grievance. And I think it flourishes a lot when there are legitimate grievances that are not heard. So, I mean, think about where anti-Semitism flourished in the 20th century. Obviously, in Nazi Germany, after the First World War, Germany entering its economic collapse, and people being galvanized around a demagogue like Hitler. In the United States, for example, one of the most popular radio hosts was Father Charles Coughlin. The Tablet has a wonderful podcast series on Father Coughlin, along with being a very melodic and talented speaker. He was almost dramatic in his presentations. He capitalized on the grievances that people legitimately had about finance and banking during the Great Depression. So I think the uptick in anti-Semitism now, I think it's important for us not to scapegoat those who, just as anti-Semites should not scapegoat Jews as just these monsters. We should not scapegoat anti-Semites as being monsters. I think a lot of cases, and I would say it's disproportionately young men who have retreated to a fairly, if not terminally, online existence, oftentimes in result to legitimate grievances. They've grown up in a culture that has told them they can't celebrate their heritage. They have to celebrate everyone else. They've been told that because they're men, they're bad. When they're boys in elementary school, they are treated like broken girls. So when they act out, they have to be put on ADHD medication. But that's the paragon. Instead of saying that girls are broken boys because they don't play hard enough, boys are broken girls because they act up too much. So they grow up with that. And then, people tell them when they want to be masculine, oh, no, that's toxic masculinity. So suddenly when they want to take pride in being a man, that's toxic masculinity. And Gillette Razors has to put out an ad, do our best. But no one's willing to say about toxic femininity and how crummy women can be. Watch the movie Mean Girls if you don't believe me. That was actually forthright to come out and say that. But when you're told that everyone else is great and you're the bad one, you get pushed down and down and down. And then so you retreat online to people who feel the same way that you do. And then also your culture tells you those things you're not allowed to say. You're not allowed to say that when it's just obviously true. Like you're not allowed to say that man who has XY chromosomes and male genitalia is a man because he identifies as a woman. And they find that to be absurd. And then the problem becomes is they start to think, I like these other people, they reaffirm me, and I like being able to point out that I'm going to say what needs to be said, even if the world tells me I'm not allowed to say that. But the problem is there are some things you're not allowed to say. It's a culture trying to put a lie over the truth, and that's bad. But just as it's true that maybe just because all geniuses are persecuted, it doesn't follow all the persecuted are geniuses. Some of them are just crackpots and nutcases that we all realize are wrong. So they start to think that, transgenderism or realities about race or crime or things like that, you're not allowed to say that even though it's true. They start to think, well, you're not allowed to say the Holocaust never happened. You're not allowed to say this or that. I'm definitely going to say it. And then they get approval from other anonymous online accounts. And in living more online, they become detached from other people, and that creates a disassociation between normal human relationships. That was also brought on by oppressive government policies that, for Gen Z, really hindered their development, during the pandemic, things like that. So I think trying to recognize and meet people where that, but honestly, we need to put forward the truth to combat anti-Semitism. But like many other conspiracy theories and other things like that, it's more of a human problem. And that I think for many people I think a lot of what we have to do is to keep people from falling into it. Extracting people from it is very difficult. I think the biggest thing that those who have fallen into it need is just to log off and cultivate offline human relationships and to go find a real girl and talk to her and see that they're not, just as all Jews don't fit your online stereotypes, not all women are Gen Z boss in a mini, okay? To get off the internet and get out of your stereotypes. And then when you start to live a normal offline life like that, it's much easier to be detached from the more crazy online views.
Let me just react to a couple of things, because I think that you said a number of things I want to draw out some implications from as I understand them. Number one can sympathize with the suffering of these young men and still rebuke the conclusions that they've come to, which I think is the appropriate stance to take. To deny the reasons for their suffering is a mistake. I agree with that. And both for that reason and because what you just said, that there's an obvious manifest necessity to draw them out of the basement and out of their online existence into society. To me, what you've just said articulates a vision and mandate for the church at this moment. And that leads me as a Jew to urge my Christian friends to step into public responsibility and into the civic arena and assert the remoralization of the culture. As Christians, which I think serves the country as a whole, and it serves my community as well.
Yeah.
I also want to have one thing that I'd like to say, a thought that is triggered in response to the very wise things that Mary said about the birth rate in Israel. Of course, it's true that even among secular Israelis, the birth rate is considerably higher than replacement rate. But I also want to point out that in the mind of Israelis, that is deeply connected, the same motivation to military service and rising in defense of the civilians which were attacked on October 7th. Israelis are conflicted in all kinds of complicated ways about the hostages and whether the war aims articulated by Prime Minister Netanyahu are reconcilable with the saving of the hostages. All of these, those kind of debates exist in Israel, and they're in many ways tortured for Israeli civil society. However, Israeli civil society does not have, by and large and for the most part, deep guilt and anxiety about the need to assert its defense. And I have to say that as an American Jew living here with my neighbors here, for us, going to the grocery store on October 8th, it was just Sunday. Like my neighbors where I live, they're just going there buying their, like Fruity Pebbles for their kids. It wasn't a normal day, even though for me, the entire world had changed. Okay, that experience is very real. The West, and I think in America in particular, can also learn something from the Israeli willingness to stand up and assume military responsibility for the defense of its people. And I think that is deeply connected to the faith in life which is manifest in the birth rates of Israeli mothers.
Thank you, Jonathan. I wanted to open it up to the panelists for any other thoughts that you wanted to share, although it seemed like you took initiative there to share them. But, and I want to take a short break before we begin our next panel at 3 p.m. But if no one says anything, I have my own thoughts and questions. I think the Hamas attack, October 7th, the war, it complicated everything, obviously. It clarified things too, right? But this Philos Catholic and the Coalition of Catholics Against Anti-Semitism, that was already in the works before the war. It was something that we've had our eyes on before. I have pondered in the last year, and speaking to those men, by the way, Mary has a great book called Primal Screams. Everybody should pick up here in the bookstore. But I've pondered a lot about the epidemic of loneliness as a former high school teacher who taught many of these boys how they're reacting on social media, the need to go out and talk to a real girl, why bodybuilder anti-Semites attack me personally, I don't know. But it's a strange thing they all have in common. So all this to say that this is something that has been on our hearts and minds from before the war, and I've thought a lot about, especially being Middle Eastern, how to untangle this issue with the current conflict. You can't entirely untangle it, but in some ways you can. And, every Catholic, in our real lives, most of us are not advising Bibi on politics, right? We do have our Jewish neighbors and our Jewish students and our schools and our communities. And I think one of the problems I see in this very digital world is that we have decided we have to all become social media influencers, commentators, and have geopolitical nuance and stances sorted out. But really, in my little life, I just have a small life. It's a limited life where I meet real people and have real Jewish friends. And as Jonathan mentioned, which I was so grateful he did, this is a sin and a stain on my soul and on the souls of my fellow Catholic and Christian brothers and sisters. And so to keep us back into real life, real actual community, what influence do I have? So nobody's asking anyone to become to solve the Middle Eastern conflict. But I just wanted to see if you had any further thoughts on that. Those are the things that I've been obsessively thinking about for the last couple of years.
I want to just share, I began by thanking some of my teachers and friends, and I want to end by offering another note of gratitude on a much grander theological scale, because I think that as a Jewish person, I'm looking out in the world and seeing something that is genuinely new under the sun. I think unprecedented in the long history of the Jews. I know that the metastasizing anti-Semitism, especially in online spaces, especially among the lonely and the suffering, is a real thing. And yet I also know that for perhaps the first time in history, there are millions of Christian friends that do not feel that way and feel the opposite. So many millions, in fact, that perhaps for the first time in history, there are now more Christians who care about the fate of the Jews than there are Jews. This is a blessed moment to be alive. And I want to just end by thanking Philos and thanking those people who are standing shoulder to shoulder together with us.
Yeah, I would just say I'm really grateful to see so many people who are like-minded. Really, ever since probably about 9 months ago, I can't remember how long it was, I started feeling the heat on social media when I chose to publicly respond to the Christ is King controversy. People sharing the slogan, Christ is King, which of course there is nothing wrong with the phrase Christ is King, he is King. Just like there is nothing wrong with the Arabic phrase, Allahu Akbar. It's just an Arabic that means God is great, and he definitely is. The problem is when a particular phrase becomes adopted as a slogan for a particular community bent on hatred and violence. Allahu Akbar if it's co-opted by Islamist terrorist organizations, and Christ is King if it's co-opted by Christian anti-Semites who use it as a wink and nod slogan to facilitate many of their other ideas of denigrating Jews or oppressing them and things like that. So, I mean, it's something that I've seen and I've gotten flack online about. And the thing, honestly, I don't really care what people who oppose me. I'm not hurt by the people who oppose me saying mean things. You know, you hear that your whole life as a kid. You know, when you got Jewish curly hair, people always trying to like stick stuff in it. You know, there's always people coming after you. The thing that made me more sad is not the people attacking; it's the silence of people I thought would be helping. That's the thing that makes me more sad. Of other Catholics feel like, well, it's not my thing, or I don't think it's that big of a problem. My answer is it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much. I think that of all the general population, the percent of people who believe totally radical transgender ideology is comparably small, but they have had a disproportionate impact on society to cause harm to others. Even if percentage-wise, you know, people who are viciously anti-Semitic is a small number confined to the internet, they can have a disproportionately large outcome in society and cause harm, including great harm. And just to be those Catholics and Christians who will stand up. I think about the new film that came out, Bonhoeffer, for example, the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer for Protestants, or looking at Catholics, those who are willing to stand up with truth. I love the witness in the Middle Ages. In the 14th century, you had the Black Plague, which, you know, if something bad happens, it's the Jews' fault, okay? And it's like, oh, well, they're poisoning wells. But you had Pope Clement and his physician coming out, the Pope writing in official letters saying very clear-headedly, come on, people, how could the Jews be causing this when their own communities are devastated by this? Or don't say the Jews commit blood libel when it's just fairly common children go missing sometimes, even around Passover. So to have lay people, but especially the clergy and the magisterium, to respond with graciousness, and not just gracious platitudes, but to put forward sound, cogent arguments to say why anti-Semitism is dumb. That's something I would hope you would see more in the future.
Thank you. Last thought. It's been an honor to share the dais with Trent and with Jonathan Silver. I agree with Jonathan wholeheartedly that something historic is happening here and has been happening here, and I look forward to watching it unfold over the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Trent. Thank you to our panelists. If you want to give them a round of applause. We'll take a 10-minute break and we'll start up again at 3 p.m. Thank you.